In the world of law, deadlines are pretty much everything. But what if a deadline was so powerful it could just shut a court down? We're about to dive into a legal saga that asks a really fundamental question. What happens when the clock just runs out?
So think about this for a second. Can a court's fundamental power to even hear a case just expire when time is up? It's a huge high-stakes question. And believe me, the answer is way less straightforward than you might think.
Okay, to really get this, we've got to break down two big legal ideas. First, you've got jurisdiction. Think of this as the court being a gatekeeper. Does it even have the key to open the door for this particular case? Then you've got limitation. That's the ticking clock. Did the person get to the door before the deadline? The whole story we're about to get into is all about what happens when this gatekeeper and this ticking clock have a massive collision.
And the case that brings this whole thing to life? Well, it's a property dispute that simmered away for decades before absolutely boiling over in India's highest courts. Now, what's wild here is just the sheer amount of time involved. The story kicks off with a property deal way back in 1958. The flat owners get together and form a society in '66. Then fast forward to 1987, and construction starts on a new building, kicking off the real conflict. The society tries to sue in '94, but nope, it gets bounced on a technicality. So finally, in 1999, they file the big one, the lawsuit that would eventually go all the way to the top. I mean, think about that. Over 40 years of history before the main legal fight even gets started. So after all that time, this massive battle really came down to a single, incredibly clever legal argument. It became a total showdown between our two big ideas, the court's power versus that ticking clock. The defense came up with something that was, well, kind of brilliant in its simplicity. They didn't just say, hey, you're too late. No, their argument was much bigger than that. They said, because you're too late, this court has lost its basic power, its jurisdiction, to even listen to you. It was like they were trying to lock the courthouse doors before the case could even be heard.
And this lays out the two opposing views perfectly. On one side, you have the society. They're arguing, look, jurisdiction is a narrow thing. It's about territory or money or the subject. Being late, that's an issue for a full trial. You don't just throw us out at the very start. But the developers on the other side, they had a totally different take. They argued for a much broader view, saying, no, if any law blocks a case, including a time limit, that's a jurisdiction issue. And they had an ace up their sleeve, a special local law in Maharashtra, Section 9A, which they claimed forced the court to decide on its power first before anything else.
So after years of back and forth, the case finally lands at the Supreme Court. And in 2015, the judges hand down their ruling. And boy, it looked like this was going to be the final word.
And wow, there it is. The court's words were crystal clear. They sided completely with the developers. They said that if a case is barred by the clock, the court effectively has no jurisdiction to even hear it. That ticking clock didn't just run out, it slammed the gatekeeper's door right in their face.
Okay, so how did they get there? Well, their logic was built on three key pillars. First, they laser-focused on that special Maharashtra law, Section 9A. It had this powerful clause that basically let it jump the line and override other rules. Second, they were all about efficiency. I mean, why waste years and a ton of money on a trial if the case was doomed from the start because of a missed deadline? And third, that law used the word shall. In legal speak, shall isn't a suggestion, it's a command. The court had to check this jurisdiction issue first.
So the big takeaway in 2015 was absolutely clear. At least in the state of Maharashtra, that ticking clock wasn't just some hurdle you had to get over. Nope, it was a total knockout blow to a court's fundamental power. It really seemed like the final word had been spoken.
But you know, in law, the final word is almost never final. And what happened next? Well, let's just say nobody saw this coming.
So picture this. It's 2015, and the Supreme Court has just set this major precedent in the Foreshore case. The link between time limits and a court's power seems firmly established in Maharashtra. But then, get this, just 3 years later, in 2018, the Maharashtra state government does something pretty wild. They just delete Section 9A, the very specific local law that the entire Supreme Court ruling was built on. Poof, it's just gone.
And then the other shoe drops in 2020. A larger bench of the Supreme Court, looking at a totally different case, explicitly says, you know that 2015 Foreshore decision? Yeah, we're overturning it. Just like that, a complete 180.
So yeah, the final word wasn't final at all.
In this absolutely stunning turn of events, the whole thing got flipped on its head. It just goes to show you that law isn't some static thing written in stone. It's constantly moving and changing.
So after all those twists and turns, what should we take away from this decades-long legal journey? I mean, why does this one property dispute matter so much?
Well, there are 4 really crucial things here. First, this whole case is a perfect picture of that constant battle in the legal system, right? The push for efficiency to clear cases quickly versus the ideal of justice, which says everyone deserves a full hearing. Second, it shows us that law is dynamic in a very real way. We literally saw a law get deleted by legislators, and then we saw judges completely change their minds. Third, and this is a big one, context is everything. A huge Supreme Court ruling can be built on one little local law that can just disappear overnight. And finally, what started as a pretty dry procedural argument turned into this incredible decades-long story with a massive plot twist. It really pulls back the curtain on how the legal system actually works.
And that leaves us with the big question, the one that lawyers and judges grapple with every single day. When it comes to that clash between shutting the door quickly and hearing every story out, where is the right place for the law to draw that line? Something to think about.